LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Robert Feather, who joins us to discuss his new book, Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which makes revelations that pose major challenges to conventional interpretations of Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and the Bible itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed in 1947 and were quickly hailed as the greatest cultural discovery of the 20th century. They can tell us a great deal about how to read and interpret the Bible, as well as throwing light on the origins of the literary and philosophical traditions of the Western world. Ensuring the scrolls are understood correctly is the urgent duty of the scholarly world, but this is not happening. Instead, there is procrastination, intrigue, and secrecy surrounding their publication. Feather seeks to clarify what they really say and how they illuminate a sound interpretation of the Bible. He levels many criticisms about the archaeological methods, the political complexities, and the obscure procedures of the scholarly community which brought the scrolls to light. He argues that it is time for some courageous truth-telling about the mystery that surrounds the scrolls to this day. Hello and welcome, Robert, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greg, it's good to talk to you. I'm raring to go.
Robert, today we're going to discuss your latest book and some of the issues stemming from that, and the book's called Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before we dive into that, perhaps you could just give listeners a little bit about your personal background and how you came to be involved in this area in the first place.
I trained as a metallurgist and went to work in industry and then gravitated towards technical journalism and got into publishing magazines and editing magazines. And then I set up my own publishing company and eventually sold out and was looking around for something to do. It was really quite serendipity that someone mentioned that one of the Dead Sea Scrolls was engraved on copper, and it turned out to be ultra pure copper of about 99.5% copper. And that intrigued me as a metallurgist, so I started looking into it more closely.
Most people are going to have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Certainly they've made the news quite often over the years, but for the benefit of people who don't know, perhaps you could just give us a brief when, where, how and what of the scrolls.
Most people know about the Dead Sea Scrolls as being very, very important, but they're not sure why. And the reason really is that they bring us back 1,000 years earlier than any previous biblical material or scriptural material, because the Bible hadn't really been completely solidified at that time. And we're talking about the turn of the millennium, the time of Jesus, about 2,000 years ago. And the scrolls themselves fall into three distinct categories. There are the scriptures, the biblical type scriptures. There are the scrolls and material which tell us about the activities and beliefs and behavior of the community that lived and worked near Qumran. And then there's a third group which are sort of pseudepigraphic and apocryphal texts that didn't get into the canon of the Bible, and pseudepigraphic texts which we knew about from historians. We knew the names of them, but we didn't know what they were all about, and now we do. So we have insights that we never had before, and certainly from the biblical material, we have corrections now that we can make to the Bible, because we now have clear original material, unedited, if you like, giving different facts and different spelling of some of the words in the Hebrew Bible.
And most people understand that the Bible came from many different sources, material brought together over a long period of time, but they still regard it as and what it sets out, whether you believe any of it's factual or not, some people don't, that it is what it is and that there's nothing could really challenge it, or we would never be able to discover anything that could challenge it. But the fact that actual biblical books were found as part of the scrolls is very significant. Now, of course, these scrolls were found decades ago, and the question is, well, if there's significance here for the Bible, then why haven't any changes been made? You know, what's going on?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, the Christian Bible is basically sounded on the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible made in about the 3rd century BC. And it's been transmitted down to us through various sources. So we have a Greek version of the Bible. But the Hebrew Bible, on which most of the material that certainly the Jewish community use, is based on material that dates from about 900 AD. So 1,000 years before that, we suddenly have original Hebrew text, 1,000 years older, with corrections. Now, those corrections have not been implemented, certainly into the conventional Torah of the Jews. Some of the corrections and amendments that you see from the biblical material from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, have been partly indicated as sort of footnotes in some later versions of Christian documents, but most of them are still adhering to the old, some of them serious variants. We now, for instance, know that there are at least 6 or 7 new psalms that we didn't know about, but they appear from Qumran. We know a lot of variants, particularly in the book of Samuel, some in Genesis, some in Exodus. Things like the height of Goliath is given in the Bible, and he comes out at about 9'9". When you look at the Dead Sea Scroll version of the story of David and Goliath, we find that his height is 4 cubits, which is cubits being about 50 centimeters. He's about 6'6", which is much more realistic. So we have things that make much more sense from the versions from Qumran.
Now, as I just mentioned, obviously, decades these scrolls have been in our hands. Well, not in our hands, actually, but in the hands of some. And obviously an immense task to try and go through all this and make sense of it, because a lot of them, of course, are fragments and they're in different types of script. But as you document in your book, progress has not been going, even for such a Herculean task, it has not been moving at the pace that one would imagine with such, potentially exciting material.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, from the earliest times in the 50s, when most of the material was coming into the École Biblique in East Jerusalem and being studied at the Rockefeller Museum nearby, the material was under the control of mainly Catholic Dominican monks, and they kept a very tight control on the material for right up until the 80s, and didn't let other scholars have access to the original material. They eked it out very, very slowly. And it was a huge task, you're right. There were about 850 different manuscripts represented by about 85,000 different fragments or complete scrolls. So it was a monumental task. But instead of bringing in experts from other areas, particularly Jewish scholars, they didn't have any Jewish scholars on the team right up until the late 1980s, which, slowed the whole process down.
To an outsider, it sounds quite bizarre. I mean, again, in your book, you document that, and this happens a lot in academia and in specialist areas, such as science, is that it's human beings, so inevitably egos get involved and people's careers are at stake. Perhaps grants are at stake as well, and then there's the issue of having access, in this case, by so-called unqualified outsiders, which seem to be a way to keep people out. It can get involved in politics, and you even document some illegality in the shenanigans going on. So it's rather tawdry tale, isn't it?
It is, and I think, a lot of it was selfishness, aggrandizement, and maybe some material that they didn't actually want released very easily until they had understood it themselves, because some of it was very challenging to the church, to Christianity. And it was only by pressure from their peer colleagues, scholars, that in 1990 the material was suddenly became available to the whole of the academic and the rest of the community, only by pressure, extreme pressure. The excuses that were made were that it was just too difficult a task, there wasn't enough money, they couldn't do the work very easily. But we now know that they'd made a concordance, which was the way that the whole situation was broken open. At least 30 years earlier, they translated most of the critical material, which they said they hadn't done, but it was available to them because they'd produced a concordance. So they had the material, and a concordance picked out, similar sections, and you could look at them. And by putting those together, they were brought into public domain.
A side point arising from what you just said was, who owns this material, and who then pays for it to be stored and gone through?
That's an amazingly complex. And you're right, there was political problems. The situation wasn't as clear cut. You had initially the material was in the British Mandate of Palestine, which was then ceded to the Jordanians. And when the partition, if you like, came, the United Nations established the right of Israel to have its own sort of section of that part of the country. The Jordanians still retained control of the area around Qumran and the caves, and of course East Jerusalem was still in the hands of the Jordanians. So the Israelis didn't have access to the material, and it belonged to the Jordanians at that time. And the Copper Scroll, which is one of particular interest to me, which was found in 1952 in Cave 3, now resides in Amman in Jordan because of this historical fact. In 1967, the Israelis took over most of the West Bank and all of Jerusalem. So the whole of the possession of the scrolls came into their hands. But they didn't stop the Dominican monks from carrying on their very restrictive work from 1967 right up until about 1987. For some reason, even then, they didn't insist on Jewish scholars being placed on the translation team, and ownership now is mainly within Israeli hands. Some material has gone to universities around the world, and of course the Copper Scroll, which I mentioned, is now in Amman.
It seems strange not having Jewish scholars involved for so long. I mean, we know how belligerent the Israeli authorities can be over various things.
Yes, and that's a bit of a puzzle. I think there were very sensitive issues in relation to Jordan and Israel at the time. Political issues entered into it, and taking over control of the Archaeological and the museum, the Rockefeller Museum, in which they were being worked on and stored, would have been a bit of a political hot potato. So the Israelis didn't want to stir things up, I think, at that time, and left the status quo. However, I think when you look, and certainly in my latest book, The Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of the reasons which have been proffered previously about lack of money, difficulty in the task, jealousies, restrictions on material being very, very sensitive to the church, even the absurd comment that these, although they were Hebrew and Jewish documents, the Catholic monks were in a better position to objectively decipher them, which is quite absurd. But there also was, unfortunately, an elephant in the cupboard, or in the room, if you like, which no one has before mentioned or discussed, and that was an inhibition against Israel by the Jordanian people who had some control, and the Catholic monks in the École Biblique who resented the fact that Israel had taken over in 1967 control of their important site and the whole of Jerusalem, and they resented that, and so they resisted very fiercely releasing the material because of that.
Now, considering the Dominican monks' role here, it begs the question of the people going through these documents, what their spiritual beliefs are, if they're religious, what they're affiliated with. I mean, that's bound to have an effect. Or, I mean, can they really be thoroughly objective?
Well, no, I don't think they can, and that's rather unfortunate, actually. Certainly, and it works on all divides. In fact, unfortunately, the Christian scholars and the Jewish scholars and some Islamic scholars as well who have got involved bring a lot of baggage with them, and they see things in terms of the Christian perspective, and the Jewish scholars put a Jewish slant on what they're trying to translate. Even worse, the translation is one thing, and that is part of the motivation for black holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Emmanuel Tov, who was the last editor-in-chief of the scrolls, translating the scrolls, produced volume 44 of a mammoth book, or series of books, Discoveries in the Judean Desert, of all the material that had been found at Qumran, or virtually all, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and translated into English and other languages. When the 44th volume was published, he said, put his hands up in joy. Good, I've done it, I've finished, it's all complete, I'm going now, goodbye. And off he went to Oxford, and that was it, as if that was the end of the story. The work was translated into understandable language, but they didn't understand what most of it was actually saying. And that's where the real problems still exist.
Well, and hence the title of your book. I mean, when I arranged this interview, I had a conversation with a couple of colleagues about the Dead Sea Scrolls just to sort of test the water and see what they knew. And the basic comment that came out first was, well, it's all been translated basically, isn't it? That's basically a done deal. They didn't realise that, as you point out, there are huge gaps in understanding in this.
Well, there are. And the book starts off with an interview with Professor Geza Vermesh, who was emeritus professor at Oxford University until he died recently, and I had the privilege of spending an afternoon with him. And I kept on asking him, perhaps a little presumptively, questions that I've asked other Dead Sea Scrolls scholars and got negative replies. And to his credit, his replies invariably were, we just don't know. He didn't try and flannel make up some answer. The sort of questions I was asking him, and if you'd asked your friends, the people you inquired about what they knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, questions like, who was the plant of righteousness? Who was the teacher of righteousness? Teacher of righteousness is assumedly the person who led the very peculiar priestly, celibate, devout community to Qumran, about 130 BCE, led them there. He's named and described in great detail in the sectarian scrolls, but no one really seems to have an answer as to who he was, because he's certainly described as a person of great significance at the time, Second Temple period, and of high priestly status. Who was the plant of righteousness? Who was the wicked priest? Why did they celebrate festivals at different times to the rest of the community? Why did they follow a solar calendar? Everyone else around them was following a lunar solar calendar. These are the sort of questions that I was putting to Geza Vermesh, and he was saying, well, we just don't have a really good answer. And that is unfortunately the case for dozens and dozens of puzzles, including things like the so-called New Jerusalem scroll, the Temple scroll, which are major, almost complete scrolls found in some of the caves in near Qumran. We have full translations of those scrolls, but they don't seem to be understood at all, because there are anomalies that no one is prepared to face up to.
Just while I think of it, now you mentioned at the top of the hour a bit about your background and how you got into this. Have you caught any flack for quote unquote not being qualified?
Not being qualified in the sense that I'm not an academic and I'm not a historian, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a professional archaeologist, and I'm not, I would suppose, what they would call a historian. But in that venue, in that area, none of them are qualified in terms of numeracy, or very few of them, or material technology, which I am. And most of these scrolls require a technical knowledge, which, by virtue of the nature of people who go into theology and religious studies, are on the arts side. They're theoretically, they're artistically inclined. They're not scientists. And I don't think they've had the rigorous scientific training that engineers and scientists have had. So I resent and reject any comment that I'm not qualified. That doesn't mean very much to me, frankly. And when I consult and confront people, invariably they back down because they have no argument against the sort of theories that I'm putting forward. In fact, it's quite frustrating that very few of them have, dare I use the word dare, have dared to challenge me. They stand off. Having said that, I do have a lot of support from very high-profile academics and scholars outside the field, particularly in non-religious areas, and the French scholars are well ahead of their Western American scholars in understanding the significance of Egypt in the whole equation. Egypt doesn't seem to be a factor that they're prepared to even consider. One very high-profile professor, Professor Harold Ellens at Michigan University, is four square behind my ideas and has come out and written that what I'm saying is basically very, very tenable.
There's been many great discoveries have been made by non-academics, non-professionals, in physics or chemistry, by people who weren't physicists or chemists. But I mean, I'm very interested in archaeology generally, particularly what's termed alternative archaeology, i.e. disputing, the conventional wisdom about certain things. And having interviewed quite a few archaeologists, professional and amateur, I know that it can be really quite vicious what goes on in trying to protect the status quo. You mentioned Egypt, and that we should turn to that next, I think, because since I started looking into the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's the biggest revelation for me, was how it reorientates so many things away from Jerusalem and or Israel towards Egypt and takes it back further in time.
Absolutely, and it was the Copper Scroll which I worked on first of all, and in 1999 I brought out a book called The Copper Scroll Decoded, and I brought up an expanded version of that, The Mystery of the Copper Scroll of Qumran, and there I decipher Greek letters within the scroll, within the Hebrew text, as reading Akhenaten, and that led me to Egypt, directly to Egypt. And a lot of other pointers led in that direction. And it's quite, I don't know, frustrating, exasperating almost, that very few scholars seem to be prepared to follow that pointer. It's a huge signpost. Egypt is glaring. Egypt was right next to Israel, and it was the dominant, most advanced civilization in the Middle East at the time. And you could not expect it not to have a huge influence on Canaan, on Israel, and on the material that comes into the Bible. And of course it did. And once people took on board the fact that the name of this very important pharaoh who actually took Egypt into a form of monotheism in the 14th century BCE, in the 18th dynasty, about 1350 BCE, he expounded a form of monotheism, pure monotheism, which he imposed, if you like, on the whole of Egypt. So there was a track record for Egypt being a pioneer in coming to the idea of one God. And I think Jacob and Joseph were there with him. And I think Joseph was his vizier, which the Bible almost spells out pretty clearly. And once those kind of factors are taken into account, a huge amount of problems in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible become clear.
Where would that pharaoh have got his inspiration from? I mean, one God. I mean, does that just come to you in a dream, or is it from some other tradition, from some? I mean, just where would that come from?
I can't answer that absolutely, and I don't think anyone really can. We're talking about 3,350 years ago. But if you study the religion of Egypt and the way the whole panoply of pagan gods were sort of developed, with one top god, Ra, who was invariably the number one who everyone referred to. And I think you can see an edging towards an idea over several generations. The Amenhotep regime, his father and his grandfather, were coming towards the idea that, okay, if there's a problem, it's resolved by the top god. He rules, he dictates what the situation will be. So they must have decided, well, why do we need the other gods then? If the top god can make that decision, let's get rid of all the other gods. And that idea, I think, moves towards the idea of monotheism and one god. It wasn't my original breakthrough, if you like. Sigmund Freud, as early as the 1930s, was talking about Moses and monotheism and relating the Hebrew Bible and it's the Christian Bible as well, back to Akhenaten. He got there before most people. I'm following in his footsteps.
You said that allowing for the Egypt connection and looking at things through that lens clarifies a lot of problems that are with the Dead Sea Scrolls and also the Bible. Now, what sort of issues are we talking about in the Bible here? I mean, we could say what issues in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I ask about the Bible simply because more people were likely to be familiar with the content. Okay.
Well, we can look at two books of the Bible. Isaiah, and Isaiah is a particularly interesting prophet of the 8th century BC, and the book of Isaiah in the Bible. And in chapter 18, 19, he talks about, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, mine inheritance." Isaiah puts Egypt first, before Israel, as most important to God. And how can you understand that unless you take on board the fact that Egypt at some stage was looking towards God? Isaiah also talks about a remnant who were expelled but are still there in Egypt. Now, what can that be? That makes no sense in conventional understanding. What Isaiah is saying is that there are people who are believing in Yahweh, who are still in Egypt after the Exodus. If you take the Exodus as being about in the 13th century BC, around about 1220, 1230 BCE, they come into the Promised Land. And then Isaiah, who's another 300 or 400 years later, is still talking about people who are still stuck there. Well, who are they, for heaven's sakes? No one has any answers to that unless you look to the possibility of monotheism and a community of monotheists being stuck at a place called Elephantine and still needing to be brought out. And Professor Israelite Groll of the Hebrew University, unfortunately she passed away in 2007, she was one of the few Israeli Jewish scholars, if you like, who also studied Egypt. Most academics certainly don't look at Egypt. There's a big divide. They don't speak Demotic. They don't understand hieroglyphics. They're not interested. They're into Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and Egyptian religious areas are sort of pagan to them. But of course they're not. They weren't pagan in the time of Akhenaten. They were monotheistic. And Professor Groll, Israelite Groll, states very clearly in her study of Isaiah that he knew about Akhenaten, Isaiah knew Akhenaten, knew about this remnant of Hebrews, or pseudo-Hebrews, that were left in Egypt. And when you look at Egypt, you can answer all these sort of questions, a lot of the questions.
Now, it's very easy to see how this would all get contentious if we think back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of, how much of this material has been released and how much of it's been correctly translated. If a lot of it's saying Egypt, not Israel, then it's obviously going to be a problem for a lot of people. And you also point out we have Jewish traditions extending from Egypt, some that are in place still today. And in your section about the Kabbalah, the idea of Judaism is not exclusively Israelite, which again would be controversial.
Well, yeah, I think Kabbalah comes out of Egyptian religion. I'm not a great torchbearer for Kabbalah. I think it's mixed up with a lot of mysticism, and a lot of that goes back to some of the pagan ideas of Egypt. The idea of the spirit hovering over the body after a person dies. This is Kabbalah. This is the idea of going to, you need to unite your spirits before you can go up to heaven. This is all Kabbalah. Kabbalah. If you look at the words, the ka has to unite with the ba, the spirit of the body, and goes la'a, which means go up. So Kabbalah. The very word comes from an Egyptian concept of spirits uniting and going up to heaven and becoming a star. The whole thing is sort of a pagan concept. So I'm not too keen on that particular area, except you've got an answer of where it derives from. And one of the key things of Kabbalah is something called the Mervaya, the chariot. A chariot throne. That's all the early works of Kabbalah are centered around a fiery, golden, heavenly chariot that's flying through the air. What's that all about? Well, if you look to Egypt, which was the pioneer of chariots, although the Hittites were perhaps the developers of the chariots, but the Egyptians took chariot design and usage to its ultimate perfection. And during the time of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the chariot was raised to the highest status ever before in Egypt. And that, I think, is reflected in Kabbalah, the idea of the golden flaming chariot. And one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Song of the Seventh Sabbath songs, describes the chariot in great detail. And if you go to the Cairo Museum and look at the chariots that came from Tutankhamun's tomb, that Dead Sea Scroll is describing chariots that were in Egypt. There's no other explanation. So you have to look to Egypt for an awful lot of the answers.
You mentioning chariots brings to mind your section on anomalous artifacts in Israel. And you mentioned chariots there. I mean, what do Jewish or Israeli researchers make of things like that? Or do they just brush it under the carpet?
They ignore it. They sidestep it. They aren't prepared to confront it. I mean, if you read the Bible, Solomon and David were supposed to have kingdoms stretching from here to there and have 10,000 chariots. Not one single chariot has ever been found, to my knowledge, from that period in Israel in any excavations. The only chariot I know of is Judas Iscariot, and he's not quite the right thing. There just aren't any. So the chariots mentioned in the Bible are all describing what was going on in Egypt, as are the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon builds the first temple, but there is no trace of them archaeologically. There's virtually no evidence whatsoever for those three kings and the huge kingdoms that they are supposed to have conquered and established. You just don't find it. So something is wrong. And where the stories come from, they're based on Egyptian experience of pharaohs like Akhenaten and Tutmosis III, who had huge numbers of chariots and conquered huge amounts of land in the Middle East. They adopted into the Bible. You're saying I'm being controversial. I am. It doesn't mean that I don't think most of the Bible is true. I do actually. I think there's huge gaps in the period of those three kings I mentioned, but that doesn't mean that prior to that there wasn't actual validity and people as described in the Bible. I think they did. I think Moses was definitely a real person, and that the Hebrews came out of Egypt in an exodus, not the 605,000 that the Bible talks about, but perhaps 20 to 30,000. And actually the subject of my next book is about the Exodus, where I'll go into that in much more detail. But the bottom line is you have to look to Egypt for answers to a huge number of conundrums, particularly in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, the material in the scrolls, you talk about the Bible, you're sort of minimalist and maximalist, I think it is, that you describe different approaches to the content of the Bible, but the material in the scrolls lends credence. It backs up some of the things that have been disputed as to whether they were factual or not in the Bible.
Yes, you can certainly home in on things that the Qumran Essenes are describing as being pretty factual. And they don't talk very much about Solomon and David and Saul. It's certainly, every book of the Bible is represented by the material found at Qumran, except the book of Esther, which won't go into the reasons, I think, for that, but they didn't celebrate the festival of Purim, which is associated with the book of Esther. But all the other books are, and some of the material clearly is showing that the people at Qumran had a knowledge that had come down, all the way down from the Amarna period of Akhenaten, and brought that knowledge with them, either in written form, but probably oral form, memory, transmitted. And they knew things about the geography and layout at Amarna that could not possibly be known unless they had knowledge, and the Hebrews were there at some stage in the period of Pharaoh Akhenaten's rule.
And there's also the idea that a number of researchers have been putting forward for some time, that of Islam, Christianity, Judaism basically having a common origin, and perhaps, how can I put this, religious scholars would buy into that to a certain extent just through their own study. But is that something that might have affected, in terms of publishing the Dead Sea Scrolls material for public consumption, that would be a bit too controversial?
I don't think so, because what's happened is that they've produced the translations in various languages that you can read, the complete works of the Dead Sea Scrolls of Geza Vermesh. George Brooks has brought out a wonderful book on it, in co-authored with two other people. The translations are all there. They haven't hidden those. What they haven't done is explain what they've translated. You've got three very, very important sections. The so-called New Jerusalem scroll, which is a very complete scroll in clear square form Hebrew, easily read, and you've got the Temple scroll, which Yigal Yadin recovered in 1967. Very detailed descriptions of a huge temple, of a huge city, great architectural descriptions, and it never once mentions Jerusalem, because it's not talking about Jerusalem. It's talking about the capital city of Akhenaten, which is now called Amarna. And that's a real problem for scholars. So they don't even go there. They don't even go there. Even in the main line Bible, Ezekiel, if you look at Ezekiel chapter 47, in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, any Bible, and even the Muslim Bible, because they follow the Hebrew Bible as well as parts of the Christian Bible, Ezekiel is talking about a huge temple on the banks of a vast river. What's that? Impossible to be anywhere else but Egypt, and that river has to be the Nile. And the city and temple he's talking about is also the same huge temple that Akhenaten built at a new virgin city. And the only explanation is that it has to be in Egypt. Ezekiel never mentions Jerusalem as the place for that building he's talking about.
So What was Jesus' role in any of this at all? Because you touch upon the idea that there were certainly messianic figures before his time, and just does he figure in all of this in any way?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that therein lies some of the sensitivity for the Dominican monks. Initially, there was great excitement, and I can imagine in the Vatican, they were jumping up and down and thinking, now we're going to get proof of Jesus' existence from these scrolls. They spanned the period of his life. The material was being written around 130 BC right up until 68 CE, although some of the material is much older, it goes to 4th century BC. And if you take Jesus from being about 4 BC to about 33 AD, then the Qumran Essenes were writing in a period of Jesus' life. So the Christian theologians were desperate to find something in the scrolls talking about Jesus. They couldn't find anything. There was nothing. But that doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't involved with the Qumran Essenes. I think he was. And the subject of my third book was the secret initiation of Jesus at Qumran. And I think Jesus was a member of that community, as was John the Baptist. So there is a huge connection to the Dead Sea Scrolls through the membership of that community of Jesus and John the Baptist.
Now, you mentioned the Vatican a couple of moments ago. There was certainly one thing I did know about the Dead Sea Scrolls quite a long time ago, was that there was some talk of a conspiracy involving the Vatican and the scrolls, but you don't seem to really think there was anything to that.
I think there might be an element of it, yes. There was the Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, a book by Bagent and Lee, which maintained that material was being suppressed and hidden away. It might be that some material is still not available to us because it was too sensitive for the church. But I don't think that that is the main reason for the holding back of the material. I mean, it's what I described earlier, other reasons. And the person who really brokered the release of the scrolls was someone who worked in London. And we owe him a huge debt because he did more than anybody else to free up the scrolls. And he is an unheralded hero who should have been recognized early on. His name is John Franks, and he worked for a foundation, a charitable foundation. And he got that charitable foundation, the Wolfson Foundation, to channel money towards the people who were doing the editing so that they had the funds to do the work, because they were always short of funds, and that was really one of the big restrictions on the scrolls coming out. Lack of money, plus this resentment by the people in charge of the Israeli input.
Now, another side point, just of particular interest to me. Why were these messianic figures in ancient times linked to Apocalypse? Wow,
that's a really, really tricky question to answer. And the whole of the outlook of the Qumran Essenes, when you read their literature, their own material about their own beliefs and practices, was apocalyptic. They were waiting for a final apocalypse when not just one, but 3 messiahs would return, certainly 2 at least, and the sons of light, which they designated themselves as, would do battle with the sons of darkness. Same principal ideas in Christianity and particularly in Islam. And the messianic figures that they were waiting for, again, they're black hole figures for most scholars. They don't know who the heck they are. They talk about a kingly Messiah and a priestly Messiah. There is no reference to a priestly Messiah in any scriptural texts about Messiahs. But the Qumran Essenes are talking about a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah. They're not talking about King David or some high priest. They are talking about Akhenaten, the king, and his high priest Merira as the messiahs that will come back to help them fight against the sons of darkness. And even in their war scroll, which is one of their most important scrolls, found in Cave 1 in 1947, talks about the leader of the battle against the sons of darkness by the sons of light as being Merira. They even name the high priest Merira, who was Akhenaten's high priest, Merira. They name him specifically. It's very clear when you read the text what it's all about and put two and two together. It's not difficult.
Well, I asked that question because it's that outlook has had such a huge effect. It continues to have such a huge effect in the world today because of the major world religions and their outlook. But the ideas that some researchers have put forward about the community there being a fortress, and there's another one at being a pottery, partly because of all these jars that were found there. I mean, it's pretty easy to dismiss that when you read your book. I mean, it just doesn't stand up. But why the sort of the fervour to push those ideas forward when they apparently, to non-specialists like myself, they seem ridiculous?
They make me laugh, and obviously you've seen clearly as an objective person coming to the scene and looking at it with fresh eyes. There are ridiculous theories about what was going on at Qumran, and they are all basically incorrect. It was a religious center, clearly, where they were studying, writing, copying religious texts and praying. I don't understand, frankly. I think the only reason I can find is that they had nothing else to look at but to challenge conventional understanding, because they don't seem to go in the areas that I'm suggesting they should start to look at, much more important areas, not just what was going on at Qumran. Was a pottery, or a balsam factory, or a fortress. None of those are true. They were avoiding the main issues. Let's say they were looking busy, but avoiding the main issues. A lovely story about the priests in the Vatican. And one of the priests comes rushing into the Pope and says, "Your Holiness, Jesus has been seen in the outskirts of Rome, and he's coming here. What should we do? What should we do?" And the Pope looks at them and says, "Look busy. Just look busy."
Well, that's probably what would happen, actually. But I mean, you do mention in the book that some people with these ideas that don't stack up, they may not be completely disingenuous, but they're seeing through a particular filter, sometimes of their own specialism or whatever it happens to be. So what they see in the text or on the ground at the site compared to what you would see could be different.
I think people see into situations, and this applies to all sorts of disciplines, what they want to see if they've got a political or religious motivation, or a specialism. If their specialism is in unguents, in perfumes, or in pottery, they'll look for pottery in the site. That will be the main motivation, and they will find some very important theory about the pottery of that particular, when it might be something completely different they should be looking at. And the people who think that Qumran was a mass manufacturing center for pottery, supplying the rest of Judea, are absolutely absurd. But they're specialists, Magen and Peleg, specialists in jars, in ceramics, in pottery. The person who puts forward the theory that Qumran was a fortress, Norman Golb of Chicago University, his son served a prison term for trying to propagate his father's ideas illegally. He's a belligerent sort of person, and unfortunately, he sees a fortress there. He's an aggressive sort of person. Aggressive people see fortresses. We're all bringing baggage to including me, I'm sure, and not being objective. But some things are just so out of possibility that it's almost laughable.
But it also seems that whatever these alternative theories are, they don't change the contents of the scrolls. So that they'd have to correlate there.
They're side issues. They're actually they're distractions from the main interest that people should be pursuing. They should be pursuing the meaning and real message and understanding of the words that are now available, all available. Why is the New Jerusalem scroll, for instance, talking about the high priest and festivals that are not known previously, and the high priest being crowned with 7 crowns? I've never heard anyone sort of question that. They read it. Oh, fine, seven crowns. But why? There's no record of 7 crowns being placed on the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem. That's completely an unknown. But 7 crowns were the normal practice in Egypt. There are 7 different crowns that a pharaoh would have, or a high priest could be crowned with. There's the answers. They're there staring them in the face, and they don't want to look at them because they're frightened to go there, frankly. And I get actually a bit exasperated that they're not prepared to look at these questions, and they're more interested in what was some kind of side issue at Qumran.
An issue that's come up time and time again when I've interviewed archaeologists, historians, whatever, when we're dealing with ancient history, has been they've wanted to stress how wherever it's been around the world and to whatever extent, but it was true to say that people saw the world differently thousands of years ago. They thought about things differently, without being really specific about what ways those are, but quite often they're really important if we're trying to understand their world.
I'm sure, Greg, you're right, and it's very difficult for us today to transpose ourselves into their situation and think, how would they react? I mean, people say, well, why was Akhenaten able to turn the whole of the country into a monotheistic believing country when they'd all been believing in idols throughout the country? And all the temples he managed to close and tear down the monuments to Khons and Amun and Ra and all the other gods. And we think, that's incredible. How did he do that? We don't understand, and I'm sure it's difficult to put ourselves in that position. But the role of the pharaoh at that time, 3,000, or any pharaoh, for instance, his word was absolutely inviolable. Whatever he said or whispered happened. You remember, do as I say, and people did not dare challenge it. We don't understand that concept today, but the pharaoh was looked on as a god. When you take that kind of thought into account, whatever he said would be absolutely immediately acted on without question. Those are the kind of mindsets it's difficult to get into. But don't get me onto mindsets, Greg, because your questions have been really stimulating. And it's the mindset of scholars today that can't get themselves into the role and existence of what was going on at the time when these scrolls were composed. They're still thinking in current 21st century terms. For instance, they call one of the scrolls the New Jerusalem scroll, where it never, ever mentions Jerusalem. But they've got nowhere else to go. They're stuck in a mindset. And getting themselves into the minds of who wrote that scroll and what it was like when that scroll was composed will make them realize that Jerusalem is not. In fact, he never mentions Jerusalem in the scroll, never once. But they put it in because that's the way they are thinking.
As I mentioned when I've interviewed archaeologists and historians, I mean, this applies also particularly to scientists who are working on what are regarded by the mainstream as fringe areas. They say to me over and over again that, as I mentioned before, egos and money, careers, all the rest of it are quite often have much more of an effect on research and what gets published than almost anything else.
But I think it's going to be quite some time. More and more scholars and academics are actually coming up to me and saying, I think you may be right, Robert. You may just be right. But what are they going to do? Go back to their university in front of their students, their next lecture, and saying, look, kids, I've been telling you a load of rubbish. Or at least I haven't been telling you the whole story. And now we've got to start again. We've really got to start again and look at the theological studies and the Bible and the Quran and the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible and look at it from a different perspective and take on board the origins of the religion, which are not what we've been telling you before. It didn't all come out of Abraham and Moses and Canaan. It came out of Egypt. You can see clearly Moses came out of Egypt, and he brought a lot of it with him, of course. That, going to the real roots, hasn't been accessed yet.
Well, there was a story just this last week that made some mainstream media outlets, and the headline was something like, "Human DNA found on 400,000-year-old bone fragment." And they had a guy on, and the two giggling, idiotic presenters were there, a man and a woman. They were talking to this guy they'd got on, and he was explaining very enthusiastically about how the textbooks were going to have to be rewritten. Well, I've heard that expression before, and textbooks in schools, certainly the ones that I remember, still exist in different editions with information that's just provably false. It's established, it's even mainstream that's no longer the case. But a lot of these texts are out there, and kids, and indeed adults for that matter, are still learning about stuff that's been disproved.
I'm afraid there's a huge amount of inertia, and it's very difficult for, as I say, for a professor to backtrack on what he's been teaching for the past 30 years. He's just not going to be able to do it. The only way the things will start to change is when he retires, and a new student comes along with a fresh outlook and is prepared to look at other possibilities. Yeah, I mean, look at Göbekli Tepe. They're now proving that quite advanced civilization goes back 10,000 years. Not the 5,000 years of the pyramids, but another 5,000 years before that. There were sophisticated temples and engravings, and obviously a very well-organized civilization, pushing conventional chronology of history right the way back. A lot of people are going to resist that, but they can't because it's engraved in stone. And sometimes it's only hard rocks that will make people change their views. And for the ideas that I'm putting forward, there are hard rocks and inscriptions that prove what I'm saying is true. I don't know how I'm going to get through to people who are not going to relish their careers being undermined, but bit by bit, people are coming around.
Well, you say about some hard evidence can't be refuted, but there's that expression from fundamentalist Christian circles, the devil put the dinosaurs here. And also, who was it that said science advances one funeral at a time?
I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, we were supposed to climb on each other's shoulders and learn. And I've learned from other people. I'm always prepared to correct things when I've got something wrong. A lot of people aren't. They're really stubbornly imbued with their ideas. And I have to say I've enjoyed talking to you, Greg, because we've covered a lot of ground. And I hope that some people will come back and challenge me, because since I wrote my first book in 1999, very few scholars and academics have actually tried to challenge me. And I don't know. They're not prepared to do the homework, or this is why we've got all these fringe theories about Qumran. That's much easier for them to go at than to come and look at the main issues squarely and realistically.
Well, perhaps as a final point then, obviously there's frustration that comes through in your book, and naturally very understandable, but clearly through your own efforts you're trying to move the situation forward. How do you feel about, as we stand now in the early part of the 21st century, about Dead Sea Scroll research generally, about the direction of travel? Are there lights on the horizon, so to speak?
There are glimmers. I think that the good work is being done in France, of all places, where for some reason, I think historically, because of Napoleon and Champollion, who deciphered hieroglyphics, they are attuned to Egypt much more than Western or non-European, French European scholars. The French books, if you look at them, and scholars are much more attuned to the possibility of Akhenaten and the origins of the Bible and the Exodus, they are there ahead of their American and English counterparts and other countries. So it's a question of education, I think. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It'll dawn on people sooner or later that I've got to revise my views, because I'm going to be a fossil in a situation where things have moved on.
Well, in conclusion, perhaps you could just share with listeners details of your website. You say your latest book, as we've been talking about, Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's available everywhere basically, but perhaps you'd like to tell people some of your other books, or just anything you'd like to share.
Okay. My website is robert-feather.com. I've got quite a lot of television programs out there as well. I've got one coming up on Yesterday Channel soon, and another one on Ancient Aliens. I must say I was very hesitant about doing something on Ancient Aliens, because it seemed to me a bit possibly controversial, but it's a very realistic, and the questions that I had in advance were very sensible questions, so I've done that one. I've written The Mystery of the Copper Scroll of Qumran, which came out in 2007. It was published in America by Inner Traditions and in London by Watkins Baird. I did one on Joseph Milik, who was a Polish priest originally, working at the École Biblique. He was assigned the translation of the Copper Scroll, so I was very keen to speak to him, and I did. I spent many hours talking to him. And then I co-wrote a biography of him, Doyen of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all about Joseph Milik. And then I did this Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I also did, strangely enough, my first venture into fiction, something called A Clash of Steel, which is about the alleged spear that went into the side of Jesus. And I looked at that from a metallurgical viewpoint, and also a fast-moving thriller, if you like, based around the spear. And those are the sort of things that I've been up to at the moment.
Excellent. Well, Robert, thanks once again for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Greg, thank you very much indeed.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.